Wow, what a fast-moving day it's been.
Yeah.
Welcome back for the final panel. It's been a lot of intense discussion and conversation. We appreciate your being here for Africa's Transformation, welcoming 92 member councils of the World Affairs Councils of America, and welcoming the audience of Africa Today TV. It's great to be broadcast across the nation. I want to thank the World Affairs Council of Washington, D.C. for making this broadcast possible, and especially to Heidi Shoup, President of the World Affairs Council of Washington, D.C., and Tony Cully Foster, my friend, who was instrumental in arranging this opportunity as well. We're delighted to have a distinguished panel and also a distinguished moderator, Karen Attiah, Opinion's Deputy Digital Editor and Producer of The Washington Post. Karen has several years of experience writing on and reporting about international affairs, culture, economics, and development, with a particular interest in West Africa, from which we've seen so many difficult headlines these past few weeks. To her immediate right is Todd Moss, Chief Operating Officer and Senior Fellow for the Center for Global Development. In addition to his institutional and fundraising responsibilities for CGD, Todd's work focuses on U.S.-Africa relations and financial issues facing sub-Saharan Africa. Todd directs the Emerging Africa Project and is currently working on energy in Africa, cash transfers in new oil economies, and new ideas for upgrading U.S. development policy. To Todd's right is Raymond Gilpin, Academic Dean at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, National Defense University. Raymond, you have a very long and distinguished biography. Prior to joining the Africa Center, he served as director of the Center for Sustainable Economies at the U.S. Institute of Peace, academic chair for defense economics at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and he's held several positions at Intellibridge Corporation, now part of the Eurasia Group. And finally, last but not least, to my left, Amadou, who's a senior fellow, Global Economy and Development, Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institution. Amadou serves on the editorial board of the Global Credit Review. He was previously Deputy Division Chief of the Financial Surveillance Division in the International Monetary Fund's Monetary and Capital Markets Department. There he led the Financial Sector Assessment Program for the Democratic Republic of Congo, served as Deputy Mission Chief for the Italy FSAP, and participated in the France Article 4 mission. He focuses on banking, capital markets, and macroeconomics in Africa and emerging markets. Welcome to you all. This is going to be a great program. Thanks very much.
Can everyone hear me? No? Let's see.
Yeah, it's on.
Okay, it's on? No.
It's got to turn on at the back.
Hello, test, test. Okay. All right, brilliant, great. Well, everyone, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this discussion today, and I have a wonderful group of panelists to my right to help kind of illuminate some of the trends as well as the headlines on Africa that you have been reading. So one thing is, well, you know, Africa is clearly a very large continent. I mean, Africa has 11.6 square miles of land, thousands of ethnic groups, thousands of languages, and we have an hour to talk about it. But we hope to at least, again, use the headlines that you've been reading about, and try to kind of get behind what's going on. So first of all, I want to start with an interesting Economist issue last year, which declared that Africa is rising. And I'll quote, "Real income per person has increased by 30%. Africa is the fastest growing continent. Over the next decade, GDP is expected to rise an average of 6% each year. Many goods and services that used to be scarce, like telephones, are widely available. Africa has 3 mobile phones for every 4 people. By 2016, nearly 30% of households are expected to have a TV set. Nigerians produce more movies than the US does, and opinion polls show that almost 2/3 of Africans think that this year will be better than the last. So I want to focus on this Africa Rising meme and this idea that GDP, an explosion of GDP, is a reason to celebrate. And I will start with Todd. Again, is this a good thing, or are there underlying trends that we should be worrying about beyond this headline of explosive African growth?
I mean, I think the headline numbers are super encouraging because through most of the 70s and 80s, Africa wasn't growing very fast, if at all. Now we're starting to see these economies grow at 5, 6, 7. Some countries are growing at 10% a year. It's going to take a while to catch up to the lost years from the 70s and 80s, but we're seeing tremendous opportunities, particularly in places like West Africa, where I know people are sort of obsessed about the Ebola crisis, but actually West Africa is one of the growth engines for the global economy. And what I think is most exciting about this is that some of the headline numbers in the past have been about essentially natural resource discoveries, and we still have countries like Equatorial Guinea, which are almost exclusively about the offshore petroleum sector. A lot of these fast-growing economies are not commodity-based economies. So countries like Rwanda and Ethiopia are 2 of the fastest-growing economies, and these are largely agriculture, financial services, not the traditional enclave sectors. Even a country like Nigeria, which is the biggest country by population and has a bigger economy than South Africa's, Nigeria's oil sector is relatively stagnant. Its growth is being driven by infrastructure investment, by financial services. And why that's exciting is because that means those other sectors filter down into the population. So it's not just a small elite that have access to oil money that's getting rich. We're actually starting to see the rise of middle classes, which then has all these follow-on effects. So I think that's the exciting trend.
Raymond, what would you say?
I would agree with Todd. The headline numbers are exciting, but as he said, we need to take them in perspective. Even though African countries are growing really fast, to make up for the lost years, they should be growing even faster at unprecedented rates for the next decade. But what I want to talk a little bit about is how these numbers translate into the ordinary households in Africa. What we're noticing is not just that services are expanding beyond the main cities, but we're noticing the emergence of a middle class. And the middle class in US terms. Because I was talking to somebody and said, what does it mean? What does an African middle class family look like? Exactly like yours. They own a house, which is usually paid for. There's not a really big mortgage market, so most houses you see are already paid for. They own 2 vehicles, which look like the ones you drive here. They go on 1 holiday a year, and that number is expanding. Take Nigeria, for instance. Nigeria has 170 million odd people. Most people think that the middle class is about 5% of the population right now, which is small in relative terms. But think about it in absolute terms. 5% of Nigerians exceed the total population of a few European countries. Think about it in market terms. And then look beyond Nigeria to South Africa, to Rwanda, to Ethiopia. These are all growing. So you think not just about Africa in terms of the 54 countries, but think about Africa in terms of expanding markets that are really liquid, because these are cash economies, while our traditional trading partners are still experiencing severe economic difficulties. And so the growth numbers are not just about Africa, addressing poverty, etc., but it's about Africa presenting new opportunities in the global economy and for both investors and institutional partners.
Yeah, I mean, so typically we get a lot of questions about Africa, and my sense is that viewed from Washington, Africa is viewed through a few lenses like aid, humanitarian issues, oil. So in Texas, they know Africa pretty well. Or, conflicts. So it's about security, about terrorism in Africa, and some groups like in Somalia and so on. But recently, there's a new lens through which people are looking at Africa here in Washington, and it's China, the Chinese lens. So China now is the largest trading partner of Africa, so it has overtaken all the others. And if you add other so-called BRICS, Brazil, India, and even South Africa, Africa is getting globalized increasingly through China and through these other emerging markets. So traditionally, the big trading partners they're still important, the European Union and the US, but the growth, the energy is really coming from the region east of Africa, from Asia. And that's creating a lot of questions, a lot of anxiety sometimes from different parts of the world. But, there are interesting facts. For example, one would think that China is in Africa mostly for the natural resources. It is, but it's also investing in a wide variety of sectors. Shoe manufacturing in Ethiopia, and so on. And it's also in a more diverse set of countries than the US. So when you look at investment from the US to Africa, it's a few countries. It's Nigeria, it's Angola, it's South Africa, and Mauritius for the financial services. It's very natural resource oriented. But if you look at China, they will be in Zimbabwe, where the US would not go, but they would be also in Angola. Half of the Angolan oil exports go to China now. So this is very, so China is playing this catalytic role, and hopefully it's pushing other partners to really look at Africa with a new sense of opportunities. Yeah.
And speaking of looking at new opportunities, so just 2 months ago or so, we had the U.S.-Africa Leadership Summit, which was one of, if not the largest gathering of African leaders in D.C. at one time to talk about some of the opportunities that we're discussing here, more investment by the private sector within Africa. So I'm wondering, is that representing a new era for U.S.-Africa relations and for U.S. direct investment in Africa? I'll start with you, Raymond.
I think the U.S.-Africa Summit provides a lot of opportunities, but there are also great challenges ahead. Amadou mentioned the investment dimension. We don't have a lot of American companies investing in Africa. There are a number of reasons for this.
What are some of those?
You could talk about familiarity with the African trading environment. You can talk about institutional issues. You can talk about corruption. There are a number of things that really do need to be addressed. But if you do look at the data, things like the World Bank's doing business reports, most of the good performing countries are countries that are taking steps to address things like the institutional rigidities, the regulatory challenges, and corruption are African countries. And so some efforts are being made to make Africa a more appealing destination to U.S. investment. But the other dimension is one of governance. And I was really happy that at the summit, a lot of time was spent looking at not just governance as we would think about it generally from a democratic perspective, but also governance from a security perspective. Most of the African countries that are struggling have had recent security challenges. So we do need to visit the security paradigm and the way we engage with Africa as far as security is concerned. And at the meeting, we unveiled a number of initiatives, two of which focus squarely on governance issues and peace and security. And I think these are very interesting developments that would start creating the sort of trading partners that would make us all feel a lot more comfortable and confident in the future.
Are we seeing a reset of sorts in the U.S.-Africa relationship? Are we seeing, on one end, are we seeing a move away from looking at Africa as a charity, more of a, trade not aid? Are we going towards that sort of relationship with Africa? And then another question that was brought up quite often during the U.S.-Africa summit is, now is the U.S. playing catch-up with China as far as its engagement on the continent? Amadou.
No, I would not overlook what the U.S. the U.S. engagement with Africa. I mean, there have been a number of great initiatives. We can cite President Clinton's Africa Growth Opportunity Act, which allows a quite substantial number of products from Africa to come duty-free to the U.S. President Bush also has done a lot in terms of the health, AIDS, and so I think the new thing here, what struck me was one, the involvement of the business community. It was the first time really that many African presidents were sitting where you sit and listening to business people from Africa and from the US tell them what their thoughts about the continent was. So I think that business element, and of course the new initiative, the Power Africa one, which is consistent with this new thinking in Africa that the economies need to transform themselves, this transformational agenda, and that, for example, infrastructure bottlenecks are really costly, and we need to have better infrastructure and more infrastructure. So, I mean, that also leads me to the fact that, so that we understand, some other parts, though, of this transformation we need to understand better. For example, if you look at the labor in Africa, a lot of labor is leaving agriculture, the rural areas, to go in the cities and to go into services sector. So how sustainable is this new growth engine is? And we have very interesting questions, less answers, but good questions.
So I think that there was definitely an element of reset for the White House at the Africa Summit. So President Clinton had a trade, President Bush had the Millennium Challenge Corporation and PEPFAR, the big AIDS program. They'd really put markers down that Africa was becoming more important. And I think there were huge expectations for President Obama when he came in. His father was from Kenya. He had talked very big about putting US-Africa relations on a new level. And the first term it fell completely flat. It was a total dud. He spent less than 24 hours in Africa, launched a couple of initiatives, they all fell flat. And there was a real sense that the US was falling behind. African leaders felt that the US was not giving them the proper respect and attention at exactly the time that the Asians were pouring in. And so the summit was really a chance for the White House to say, look, we haven't forgotten you, we're actually going to put our relations with the continent on a higher level. And what I think was really encouraging is that there were a lot of security issues discussed, but really it was business deals front and center. And we saw $17 billion in new commitments from private American companies, and we're talking about household names like Walmart, IBM, General Electric, and you even saw some really small American companies going into Africa for the first time. There's a little company in Leesburg, Virginia called Precision Auto Tune. You go and you get your car. It's like you get your oil changed, and they turn it up. They've just started opening in Lagos, Nigeria. So you are starting to see more business interest. The White House I think they did a terrible job in the first term. In the second term, they've done a terrific job, and they actually brought together amazing people to sit with African leaders and African business people and actually get some deals done, which can only start to feed on itself over time, which I think is beneficial.
But if I may, I mean, the first term, I don't see it really as being terrible, because the U.S. had the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. And if the global engine doesn't work, Africa would, of course, not benefit from what, from the U.S. So
that's true.
Now, somewhat moving on, well, talking again about the U.S.-Africa summit, the U.S. media, at the very least, again, this was a historic, unprecedented summit. However, what was dominating the headlines was Ebola. The first question from a U.S. reporter at the conclusion of the summit was, what about Ebola? I feel like this is something that we do need to address, Ebola, this lethal disease that's been ravaging Guinea and ravaging Liberia and ravaging Sierra Leone. The largest outbreak in history with almost 5,000 deaths as of today and 13,000 cases. President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has called this the biggest threat to national security since Liberia's civil war. In light of having this kind of reset towards Africa and this optimism towards Africa and towards West Africa in particular, Sierra Leone and Liberia were experiencing very high levels, high rates of growth before this outbreak. How is this challenging, this Africa Rising theme, and especially with the optimism coming out of the Africa Summit? Does Ebola mean that with all the rates of growth and the talk about partnership and aid, where did we go wrong? Where did these countries go? Where did the international community go wrong with these countries?
Want me to take that? I think it's very important to keep in perspective. These are Ebola is devastating for those three countries. Liberia has a very long, very intimate relationship with the United States, founded by freed American slaves in the middle of the 19th century. The capital is Monrovia, named after James Monroe. They've got an area of the country called Maryland. Very, very close ties to the U.S. We had been spending a lot of time time and effort helping them recover from a terrible civil war, and this is setting everything back. It is an existential threat for those three countries. But I think we need to put that in perspective, that these are three very small countries. The one case of Ebola that happened in Nigeria was contained. We're seeing, I just heard the other day that a U.S. trade mission to Kenya was just canceled because of Ebola. London and Paris are closer to Monrovia than Nairobi is. So I think unfortunately, this media cycle has created all this completely unnecessary panic. And what I hope is that once Ebola is contained in West Africa, people calm down a little bit. It's not going to have an effect on long-term economic growth that General Electric is not going to pull out of Calabar, Nigeria over that. I'm optimistic that cooler heads will prevail, but it has been a big psychological blow.
I will agree largely, yes, that there has been hysteria and that there has been fear. But at the same time, I think there are really pertinent questions as to, the implications for our conception of public health and the implications for how we deal with health infrastructure in post-conflict societies, especially Liberia having just come out of a civil war in 2003. So, I do push back a little bit as far as responsible reporting, and coverage of those issues. And so, I'd pose it again, to the panels. What does the Ebola outbreak mean for our approach to infrastructure and governance and rebuilding in post-conflict societies?
Let me probably take a stab at that. If we look at the disease itself, it's scary. But what is more scary is the fact that unlike SARS a few years back or bird flu, it is not airborne. it's not airborne. It's person-to-person contact. And so what this unravels is a very weak and probably non-existent healthcare infrastructure outside the main cities, because that's how and why it spread so quickly. And it spread the quickest in the two countries that were just emerging from a debilitating 2 decades of civil war. And I think the takeaway from this should be, as we think about rebuilding post-conflict and post-crisis countries, yes, it's important to have state institutions, but it is also important to rebuild the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure, health and education. The second thing about the Ebola crisis was not just the hysteria in international media, but the fear in local communities, which caused many to flee, many to sell their assets to enable them to get to the nearest city, and has created a huge class of asset-poor people. What does this mean? This means that when it comes to rebuilding, humanitarianism as we know it wouldn't be enough, because that usually focuses on the income side of poverty, not the asset side of poverty. We need to think a lot more strategically about how we get these communities and how we get these affected people back on their feet, because that is, I think, the most important takeaway for me, that we have to reconceptualize our notion of building capable states that will not just be stable in their own right, but will also be dependable partners for us, both from a development and economic perspective, and also from a security perspective. And so that's part of the story. The other part of the Ebola story is that Nigeria contained Ebola. Senegal contained Ebola. All of the neighbors of those two countries have also contained Ebola. And so the question we should be asking is that it's not a West African issue, it is 3 countries that are post-crisis and post-conflict that require special attention as far as the reconstitution of basic services.
Maybe if I just can add, I mean, one unfortunate characteristic also is that Ebola was unknown in West Africa. So if you take the best doctors in West Africa, during their studies, they didn't study Ebola. They've never had Ebola cases. It was mostly in Central Africa. But so that brings to the fore the fact that when it comes to health, these type of diseases are kind of, it's a global problem. If there is some kind of a new virus somewhere in the world, I think all the countries should be prepared, given the fact that moving from one place to the other is so easy. So I think it's also a global problem, and that needs to be addressed with global solutions, with, in this case, ownership from these 3 countries. The other point I wanted to say also is if you look at from the economic impact, this disease is having a huge economic impact on these 3 countries. But if you just take the case of the government, it's like a double whammy. On the one hand, your health expenditures are increasing, you have this emergency, so your spending is increasing, and on the other hand, your revenues are falling down because the trade is going down, economic activity is going down. And there, they really need help very quickly. So that's something, again, that where the global community also has to be involved.
Okay. And so this year, another headline that dominated, especially in the very beginning of the year, was Nigeria's struggle against Boko Haram and terrorism in West Africa. I know we don't have too much time, but I'd like to sort of touch on that, and especially with you, Raymond. So earlier in the year, the big headline story was Boko Haram kidnapped almost 300 schoolgirls in northeastern Nigeria. 6 months later, they have not been recovered. And it really highlighted for a lot of the global community this group that has been terrorizing Nigeria since really actively 2009, so for several years, that has been terrorizing Nigeria, and that the government has not been able to get a handle on this group. So it really put terrorism and security into the world's sort of view. So again, as far as a challenge to that Africa rising, that Africa transforming narrative, how does a group such as Boko Haram and the government's inability to somehow really actively deal with this scourge, how does that challenge our ideas of Africa transforming?
The Boko Haram threat in northeastern Nigeria is definitely a serious challenge, but it is peculiar in a number of regards. The first is that it is this insidious transnational threat that seems to exist in an area that is poorly governed. And if you look across the world, there are many of these sort of areas where non-state actors could set up shop, claim territory and flout everything that is sovereign and decent. The problem the problem there then becomes, how do you address it in a region that has been marginalized by both central and state governments for a long time? And so it's very easy for them to blend in with the local communities, and then you ask yourself, what are the instruments that a government has to deal with something like this? And you come up with the answer, very few. Because the traditional instruments that the Nigerian government would have would be law enforcement. That's practically non-existent and ineffective. Then you think, what about the military? The military might be great, but they're not good at addressing insurgencies or rebel groups. They're good at fighting other armies. That's what they're trained to do. They're not trained to do that sort of warfare. You think about, okay, well then, what about the development side? That takes time, and it requires trust, which has not existed. And so we see this confluence of very, very troubling factors that make it possible for an entity like Boko Haram to exist with impunity. It then becomes, to my mind, more of a regional challenge. We need not just the Nigerian government, but we need the other neighboring governments to come together and say, we are going to deny them sanctuary, not just militarily, but diplomatically, economically, and also socio-economically, to ensure that they don't have the oxygen to breed and to breathe. If you remember, before Boko Haram, there was Joseph Kony doing the same thing in Central Africa.
Sudan.
And again,
Uganda.
this again speaks to the heart of what I call, in some of my classes, we have to reverse engineer the Westphalian concept. Because democracies as we know them across the world, and in Africa as well, are all about the viability of the nation states. And what the Treaty of Westphalia did was bring many European nations together into states. What we have in Africa are many states that are now struggling to be nations, to be relevant to their people. That's what nationhood is about. And we, as partners of African countries, really need to think seriously about how we reconnect them. We've been overly enamored by elections. But what we really do need to do is reconstitute this relationship between those being governed and those in governing positions at national, local, and community levels. And those are the failings, I think, in northeastern Nigeria that we need to address if Boko Haram is going to be taken care of.
So speaking of states and nationhood. This is a perfect segue into my next question about what will be the headlines to come, and that is the fact that some 30 African states will be facing elections between now and 2016, including Nigeria, which we just spoke about, including Burkina Faso, which has been in the news for the popular uprisings that have uprooted the longtime president of Burkina Faso. So looking ahead to 2015 and into 2016, with a lot of these nations facing very potentially contested elections, could we say that next year that we should be nervous about 2015 for Africa as a continent? Or are there trends that, are there elections that you're watching that you're particularly optimistic about?
So, I mean, I am at the Africa Growth Initiative, so we always look at things from the growth side, economic side. So, I mean, Nigeria is definitely, in terms of the economy, I mean, it's the largest economy now in Africa. It's, again, I've used this word 3 times, but it's a good growth engine for Africa and for West Africa in particular. So you can see already stock market in Nigeria have gone down. There's a lot of uncertainty with the oil price and the elections. So, reducing this uncertainty with, elections that are successful would be very good for that region. Else, I'm not that nervous. There will be some cases where, conflicts is possible, like Burundi or Central African Republic, which is already having some issues. But those are kind of contained, I think, and low intensity. There will be, of course, there's a humanitarian side of it. There's loss of life. There can be loss of life, so that would be sad. But yeah, so, but I would say just, if you look at the trend over time, Africa has democratized more. I mean, if you take like 30 years earlier, we had less successful elections. But I think one trend to watch is to, when we start moving from successful elections to not having the elections, just the elections as the measure of democratization, but what happens after the elections? Are we having strengthened institutions and so on? Yeah.
So, look, you've got, and I'm actually very, very optimistic, even despite these uncertainties, you've got a collision course going on here. You have what Raymond was talking about, which is the growth of the middle class, and middle class people do not want to be ruled by autocrats. Right? They do not want to live in the old world. They want to have a new world. You're seeing in a place like Nigeria an incredible rise of civil society groups, including middle class people who don't want the politicians stealing all the money, and a very active young social sector of young people that are saying, look, we are the new generation. We want to have a better future. That is colliding. That is colliding with the number of still long-time autocrats that you have in power. So Blaise Compaoré was just overthrown on Friday. He'd been in power 27 years. There are actually 10 other African leaders that have been in power at least 20 years. Many of these guys are very old men. They're all men. Some of them will pass, some of them will be overthrown. I think that's actually very positive, and we're going to see a new generation of leaders, and a lot of that will support the economic growth because these are going to be jobs and businesses that are not reliant on old, corrupt business networks. It's going to be people that are going to be rich because they're connected to Wall Street or London, not because they're the cousin of the president. And I think that's only positive in the long term.
All right.
Let me just give you 2 quick vignettes to buttress what Todd has just said. In Ghana, the last Ghanaian elections, you had for the presidential runoff, you had over 8 million votes cast. The difference between the winner and the loser was less than 40,000. But you had a peaceful transition. You had a constitutional challenge, it went through the courts ruled, and you had a peaceful transition. Largely because the Ghanaian middle class are people who understand not just the values, but they have a stake in stability, and they participated. Malawi, a few years back, the long-time head of state passed, and there was a big groundswell for the military to take over. People actually asked the military to take over. The then head of the military, General Ovilo, said, no, there's a constitution. And the constitution was followed. The vice president became head of state as the constitution prescribed. 10, 20, 30 years ago, this would not have happened. And so there's a positive trend across the continent. Will there be the odd blip from time to time? Absolutely. But that does not define the continent. I think what defines the continent is this trend of not just more participation by this, Africa's millennials, but also the realization that the institutions serve the state and not the regime.
Okay. We have time for questions. All right, right here in the booths.
Ellen Keefe.
Mike.
Thank you so much. Hi, Ellen Keefe, and thank you so much to the panel for being here and for the discussion. I know we just briefly mentioned when you said men, only men, and so that brings up women. And I just wonder if each of you may address some of the issues with the women and what kinds of things you see in terms of humanitarian rights for the future. Thank you.
Are we taking
I don't know, do you want to take it?
Yeah, maybe we can take a number of them just in the interest of time and then try to make a note and then try to answer them.
Thank you.
Sky Forster from Colorado Springs. We talked about the millennials, the changing demographics, and the optimism, and I share the optimism, although most Americans, particularly outside of the Beltway, only have one image of Africa, and it's about Ebola and civil war. But there are a lot of conflicts, obviously, on the continent. I guess my question would be the sectarian conflicts, the schisms, whether it's race, ethnicity, tribalism, or what have you. As you go through these political transitions and you move from autocracy, as you talked about, do those schisms do those conflicts become more important and less manageable, or are they going to be able to be managed indigenously within those societies? What's your sense of that?
All the way in the back.
Related to the security situation, we now have an Africa command as part of our military structure, and we often hear the expression, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so I'm wondering if, as you think about U.S. policy towards Africa, obviously we've had Mali, and now the U.S. is looking at, an air base in the area, and drones, et cetera. Can you simply give us your perspective on whether you worry that we are going to approach our policy too much from a military standpoint?
Maybe in the scarf.
Hi, my name is Liz Naduva. I'm from the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, and my question deals with primarily the first headline that you were talking about, Africa on the Rise. And my question deals with microfinance and microfinancing programs and whether or not that led to the rise that we have seen in Africa, and how has that contributed primarily, and whether or not if that will help rebuild and reconstruct the failing institutions that we've seen in Sierra Leone and Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire. Thank you.
That's a good batch. Raymond, would you like to take some of the questions about Africa and the U.S. military engagement on the continent? Oh.
Oh, that's great. I thought you were going to divvy out the question.
No. Yeah, I was just to take that stab at that particular question.
Do I think that we're going to overly militarize our approach in Africa? I don't think so. I think Africa is one of the places where we do tend to have a more balanced approach to our interventions. If you look at the response to the Ebola crisis in Liberia, what we have are uniformed boots on the ground, and the boots on the ground are doing one thing and one thing only. They're constructing field hospitals. And then U.S. Agency for International Development, U.S. NGOs who then help run and staff these entities and sensitize the communities. And places like Burkina Faso and the aerial surveillance issue that you mentioned, it's, you know, the Sahel, the Sahara Desert and everything immediately south, it's a huge area. And what happened when the so-called Arab Spring transpired is a lot of bad people and heavy weapons moved south. And it's really difficult to keep a track on what's going where. We only knew about some when they turned up in Mali, and they wreaked havoc and divided the country until the French intervened. So that's the context in which there is quite a bit of there has been some emphasis on the aerial surveillance side of things, but it's been generally more balanced than in most of the areas in the world. On the conflicts and political transition, I think that's a very good question. Politics worldwide is by nature, you know, factional. And would we see, you know, legacy groupings, be they ethnic or religious, defining politics? Absolutely, it happens everywhere in the world. But to your question, would the institutional traffic of democracy make it more manageable? I point to a country like Senegal. Senegal is very Islamic. You have the extremes of Islam in Senegal and in Senegalese politics, and we don't have the sort of extremism we have elsewhere, because both the institutions of state and Senegalese politics has matured to the extent that you could have elections, you could have people, you know, line up behind entities with which or with whom they identify, and it doesn't become a conflict, it doesn't become violent conflict. And when we meet with a lot of delegations from African countries, we point to countries like Senegal, that is religiously diverse, ethnically diverse, but has a democratic tradition that holds and is on African soil. And so we're seeing a lot of that beginning to you know, take hold elsewhere.
I wanted to go to Amadou actually on the question, Kelly's question on microfinance.
Yeah, sure. So I think that's a very interesting question, and there's a lot of changes happening in the financial landscape in the countries. So microfinance, so these small loans to people in the urban and rural areas have grown, the microfinance institutions have grown very, very rapidly. But at some point, they reach a limit. And you know, like there is this term coined the missing middle, because on one side you have the commercial banks that will only cater to the large corporations and so on, and the microfinance institution that only cater to, you know, the poorest of the poor. And you have all these entrepreneurs, these small, medium enterprises that cannot get any funding, right? So another also, so that's one. So you've seen trends, some banks, when they saw that microfinance institutions were becoming very large, like in my country, Senegal, you have very large ones. You see their headquarters, you wonder, are they really catering to the poor? It's really a successful model, but they are not banks, so they don't have access to the payment system. You cannot write a check and so on. So some banks were trying to have models where either they take over a microfinance institution, or they open a microfinance window, or they partner with microfinance institution and refinance them. So that's happening. Another interesting issue also is the mobile payments. system where you had the microfinance, it worked well, but suddenly you have these telecom operators that can offer now these mobile payments. So you can pay your electricity account with your cell phone, you can transfer money to your cousin at the village with your cell phone. It's working very well. And now you can even transfer money from Rwanda to Tanzania in different currencies, from Mali to Cote d'Ivoire to Senegal in the same currency. So it's working very well, and it's kind of compete, but also complement the microfinance institution. So a lot is happening, but this mobile payment system, and it's coming in the U.S. Sorry, I couldn't hold it.
I want to go back
it's very interesting. Yeah.
I want to go back to the first question about women in Africa. Of course, we have a male panel, but women are, a huge, huge part of Africa's transformation. So I'd like any one of you to comment on the role of women and the role of women in Africa's rise. Or should I?
Sure. I mean, I would say two things, and then I do want to comment on the militarization of U.S. policy. First, right now, arguably the most capable head of state, right, in Africa is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia. I think she's been a tremendous, I know she's much more popular in Washington than in parts of Africa, but she's been a tremendous role model for people. For young women across Africa, and I think is really seeing a very strong woman has changed perceptions among many of the other African leaders. We do see, just younger generations are going to be more used to seeing women in powerful positions. As we have fewer 80-plus autocrats and more young people come into positions of power. We're going to see that naturally. It will take time. For regular, average African women, what I found stunning is that when you look at the transition of the demographic transition where fertility plummets, in a country like Mexico or Iran, the average children per woman went from 5 or 6 to 2 within one generation. And we're starting to see that in some parts of Africa, but the only place left on the planet where fertility rates are over 5 or 6 is West Africa. And it's the poorest West African countries like Mali and Niger, which still have sort of 6+. And that's, it's a complex reason for that, but that's going to be something that's going to certainly hold back or delay the status change. But certainly that is one of the underlying demographic trends that's going to make Africa better in the future as that improves.
I think you have just a little bit more time. Okay.
Yeah, just so I was at the State Department in 2007, 2008 when AFRICOM was created, and there was very clearly, there was a lot of concern that we were going to over-militarize. If there is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb running around the Sahara Desert, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and these groups seem to be cooperating, the U.S. military is going to respond. I think we want them to respond. So we are going to see much more active counterterrorism operations in Africa. Washington Post has done a fantastic job reporting on all the forward drone bases that are being pushed out. So I think we are going to see counterterrorism. On the flip side, the U.S. government has multiple competing interests. That gets reflected in the government. We still have an interest in promoting democracy. We still have an interest in promoting development. That gets fought out within the U.S., within U.S. foreign policy. Sometimes the military is going to win. Sometimes the democracy promotion imperative is going to win. And if I can be sort of gross self-promotion, when I left state, I started writing about this, what happens after a coup when DOD fights with state about security versus democracy. I did it based on a real coup in Mauritania, and I decided it would be more fun to do it in a novel. And I wrote a thriller about a crisis manager at state working on a coup to reverse a coup in Mali during a terror threat. Happens to be for sale. I didn't know it. Happens to be for sale at the table outside.
The gold book.
It's called The Golden Hour.
Happens to be right here.
Oh, there it is. There it is.
Happens to be right here.
Wow.
However, not only can you purchase Todd's book, but you can see the extensive blogging by Amadou C. and Raymond Gilpin as well, and Karen Attiah is all over the web for the Washington Post and other sources. Thanks very much for joining this. Thank you, panel, for a great job.